Catcher in the Rye by R.D. Salinger. So this book's set in the 1950s, and it follows Holden Caulfield, a young sort of teenage lad, and it's about his growth with dealing with the trials and tribulations of growing up. But all the time he's railing against it, and this book has been quite polarizing for this reason, because the character is really unlikable. He's hypocritical, he's a complainer, he's really immature, and that is shown throughout the book. But the thing is, he feels isolated and he finds it difficult to grow up. But really the reason for all of this resistance against the growing to maturity is that he wants to retain his kind of idealized childlike view of how he sees the world, and he's trying to desperately cling on to that. So this is basically a book about his kind of desperate search that he never really voices for connection. He's actually alienating everybody around him and everyone that he encounters. It's all due to his resentment and the way he acts that is the problem. But because this is how resentment works, he's kind of blaming the world around him for all his own problems. So what actually happens in the book? Well, the 16-year-old Holden observes a tragedy. He deliberates on his interactions with women, which don't tend to go that well, unsurprisingly. He fails to do well in school, and that's probably kind of the central focus of the book, really. And he clashes with his schoolmates. So he's muddling through all of these interactions, and he's blaming everyone else for how these interactions pan out. So many of his interactions manifest in a kind of similar sort of pattern. He'll make a derogatory statement about somebody else. He doesn't like how they are or what they say for some reason. But then he's often very hypocritical, right? So he's often doing the thing that he's criticizing, or he's like lying to the other person or making assumptions about them. So there's one kind of key example is his dorm mate Stradlater. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. He always says that Stradlater never lets things go, at which point Holden is obviously pestering relentlessly to do something and not just letting it go and leaving it. So that happens quite a lot in the book, quite repetitively, I should add. I can see why it's quite polarizing, this book, because the main character's unlikable. He's irritating in these interactions, and they keep repeating. There's a kind of bit of a pattern that you'll notice with a lot of what goes on. But they serve a deeper purpose. They're an exploration of Holden's resentment and his kind of railing against his growth to maturity. And nobody really tells him that he's out of line or that he's actually the problem. And so, for example, on his date, he has a romantic date. He makes unfair and immature remarks about homosexual men, and he alienates the woman he's on the date with, and she leaves early, and he's kind of like angry about it. But again, it's all his fault. He's saying derogatory things about homosexual men. So he's the driver behind a lot of this misfortune, and his resentment continues to grow as he blames the world for it. So the kind of setting is that the book's written in 1951, and it's sort of 1950s period book. It doesn't use much archaic language. I think the language is actually really simple. But I also wouldn't call it exactly easy to read, because once you've interpreted this whole exploration of his resentment and that he's the kind of cause for everything, it does become slightly tedious to read, how it keeps repeatedly illustrating his irascible nature. Holden's, that is. So there's not exactly huge moments of dramatic tension. I mean, there is a bit of action, but Holden tends to kind of tumble and fall through all these interactions and developments. I will caveat that kind of perspective, though. It's definitely not the kind of book I would normally read, and it is quite short, at least. So I think I got through it in about 2 sessions of reading. So the length does suit the purpose, and I think it's good that it's this length potentially. So in terms of the character development, then it's kind of an interesting one to review because there actually isn't much character development, so I would take marks off for that. So it kind of fits into the kind of discussion about the length of the book, because maybe it would actually benefit from being longer, but then Holden actually changing over the course of the book. It's kind of like it doesn't really go anywhere down that path. It kind of just, he's resentful, he continues being resentful. There's no sort of change really. The only aspect in which you could argue the contrary is that towards the very end of the book, he acts differently with his sister. And the book ends on him, and I quote, being hopeful towards the future. So it's kind of implied that he at least has like a positive outlook, and maybe he will start to change, but you don't actually know if that is the case. And that could have been an interesting exploration in the book and potentially made it better. So, yeah, and I think the key part of this is that he actually has to kind of compromise and give in his immaturity, really, to grow up. You know, he's trying to prevent something happening that is inevitable. And although it ends on that kind of very slight, hopeful note, you don't really know if he's ever going to get that greater connection that he's really after. He's like a troubled individual, but then he's almost like pushing everyone else away. So will that change? It's never really explored at depth, which I think is probably a shame, really. Originality and whether it's worth your time. Well, I think obviously it's a book that probably fans of, you know, literature, classics will read. I thought it was interesting. It was definitely a unique book, but it wasn't that readable for the reasons Skip back earlier for what I said on that. The language wasn't anything special or difficult, but it's also like the difficult topics in the book, they're really like just brushed on. They're not really explored in depth, which is a bit weak, to be honest. I mean, so there's interactions which I won't explain fully, but there's Mr. Antolini, there's the part about the prostitute. They're kind of just, they sort of just happen, but then there's no real further exploration of it. Maybe it's kind of thinking about, like, because he is so resentful, he's sort of actually bringing kind of difficulty upon himself in a sense, but that's a bit, I don't think that's really the message with Mr. Antolini, really. So, but it's never explored or explained, so you don't really know what the author's trying to get at there. I think the problem is it is a kind of considered a classic, a controversial classic, but I do think it's quite far down the list of classics you could read. I think there just needs to be more exploration of some of these topics. So although I think how it's written, the length of the book works well, it probably could have benefited from being longer and having more character development, exploring the difficult topics. So the final conclusion is score for Catcher in the Rye. It's a unique book that some people might struggle through. I think there's bigger and better classics to read personally, but it's definitely unique. I've never read a book like it before, so I give it 6 out of 10 because I don't think it's a 5 simply because although it is kind of written in an average way, it does sort of stand out interestingly. So yeah, 6 out of 10 for this one. And yeah, as usual, if you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. It's really helps me out. And stay tuned for more reviews. Thanks.